Hi, you're listening to a student-focused episode of the Sociology Show podcast. If you're studying the subject at GCSE, A-level, foundation, degree, or any other discipline, then this podcast could be of help to you. If you have a question for the show, then you can email the Sociology Show podcast at gmail.com, and one of the teachers, lecturers, examiners, or experts will answer your question for you. You can sponsor the show on the GoFundMe page and subscribe on all the usual podcast platforms. If you're going to class, going to the gym, or just chilling, put your headphones in and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2U Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit tutor2u.net/sociology, and there you can pick up revision guides, flashcards, revision videos, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so the focus of this episode is an introduction to feminism, and I'm delighted to welcome back Dr. Claire Sedgwick. Claire, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
We're going to start right from the very basics. So if we do start from just a definition to start with then, Claire, how do you define what feminism is?
So it's a very broad definition. I would say feminism is the idea that women should have equal rights and should have equal opportunities to men.
But the reason I ask that is because there's some misunderstanding, isn't there, that feminism, is it about gender equality? Is it about women's rights? Would you say that there is that kind of misunderstanding as to what feminism actually is?
I mean, I think there is a misunderstanding in terms of the idea that women want more rights than men, which is not really the case. I think the fundamental thing, I guess, for me as a feminist is that my understanding is that if women have more rights and equal rights, then that benefits everybody. So, and that actually kind of men are also disadvantaged by the lack of rights to women as well. So I think in that respect, it can be understood as being clearly for the benefit of everybody. It's not like an adversarial thing where women are kind of, it's not a competition, is I guess what I'm saying.
Yes, yeah, because that's often the key thing that I try and explain to my students, that patriarchy doesn't just damage women, it can damage men as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think about, all of it's almost like a kind of the same kind of the different side of the same coin. So all of the ways in which women are kind of disadvantaged, we can think of similar ways that men have been historically. So if we think about the fact that women are often portrayed as kind of emotional, the flip side of that is that men have often been told that actually they can't express emotion. And we can see how that has a damaging impact on people's mental health. So there are lots of ways in which if we fight for gender equality, it benefits everybody.
Absolutely. I thought that was a good starting point. So let's get into feminism as you would teach it then. So what would be your starting point if you were introducing feminism, Claire?
So I'd probably start off with the suffrage movement in the early 20th century in both the US and the UK. Probably the most kind of, if you think about, early feminism, that's probably what you're thinking of. So the suffrage movement was actually comprised with two different kind of sides to it, I guess. There was the suffragists who were kind of wanted to use peaceful methods to protest, and there was also the suffragettes who very much didn't necessarily use peaceful forms of protest in order to see that women have the right to the vote. And I think that's really interesting because that kind of highlights the fact that feminism has never just been one thing. So there's always been kind of different ways in which feminists have thought about doing things. So the suffragettes would say, actually, we need to kind of use kind of more violent forms of protest, whereas the suffragists would be like, oh no, actually we need to kind of talk to people and we need to use the political kind of system. So I think that's an interesting point to start, because I think that kind of highlights what carries on throughout the feminist movement, which is this idea that fundamentally we want the same thing. So we want women's equality, but sometimes that's achieved or seem to be achievable through different means, which I think is an important thing to highlight as well.
Yeah, and we'll come on to that because that lends itself to the different branches of feminism, doesn't it? And so for first wave feminism, who should people look up? What sort of names are really important for that area?
So we've got the Pankhurst family. So we've got Emmeline and Sylvia and Christabel. And that is, and that even that family itself kind of sums up the way things split off. So Sylvia Pankhurst became much more radical. She was much more interested in kind of class and poverty, whereas Emily and Christabel weren't so much. We've also got the Fawcett, so Millicent Fawcett. So we've still got today the Fawcett Society, which is named after her. So they're kind of good examples of those kind of early figures within feminism. And then in terms of books that you can read now, and Fern Riddell wrote a book, which I cannot remember the name of, but she wrote a book a couple of years ago, which is quite good for kind of highlighting some of the misconceptions that we have about the suffragette movement, the idea that they used kind of, mainly peaceful means when actually they were kind of doing arson attacks. They were kind of, doing a lot of really kind of strong civil disobedience. So that's another one to maybe think about looking at for these kind of more contemporary histories of that period, because it shows that some of the assumptions we might make about the suffragettes might not actually be true.
Yeah. Because one of the questions students often ask is the famous incident of Emily Davison in front of the King's horse, and whether she meant to kill herself or not. No one knows, do they? Is that right?
No, nobody knows. I think that kind of, and Fern Riddell talks about this in her book, but I think it kind of shows the lengths to which the suffragettes were willing to go to. So even if you don't plan, even if you don't do it thinking, obviously, it's going to take your life, it's still quite an intense thing to do.
Absolutely.
To kind of, run in front of a horse. So I think it shows the extent to which they were quite willing to go to quite extreme lengths to get what their intent, their aim was, which was obviously the right to vote. And
at that point, the term feminism wasn't around, was it? They wouldn't have referred to themselves as feminists at that point.
Probably not. It's a term that became much more common in the kind of 60s and 70s. It's been around for quite a long time as a term, but I don't necessarily think they would identify specifically as feminists in the same way that we would do now.
So let's move on to that then. So if the word became much more prevalent a little bit later on, that lends itself to the second wave of feminism, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the second wave can be understood broadly as starting in the late 60s, around the time that we had a lot of different civil rights movements. So obviously in the US, we had the Vietnam War and the anti-war protests that happened alongside them. We also had the civil rights movement as well. And so around that kind of time of increased kind of protest and focus on kind of rights, this kind of resurgent feminist movement can be seen, focusing in both the US and the UK on specific kind of issues. So the UK is much more interested in class, whereas in the US it was much more interested in kind of rights within the law, which we can think about in terms of the different kind of flavours of feminism, whether it be kind of liberal feminism or socialist feminism.
So was it during that second wave where you started to get the break-off branches of feminism in particular then?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I do think it's probably worth saying as well is we're always categorising things after the fact. So just as the suffragette movement wouldn't necessarily call themselves feminists, a lot of feminists in that time wouldn't have necessarily, they wouldn't have necessarily called themselves liberal feminists. They would have called themselves feminists. But the areas in which they were working within can be broadly split off into these different kind of groupings. Yeah.
Who were the kind of really key important writers of that period? Who would students really benefit from looking up for second wave feminism?
So you've got people like Gloria Steinem, who was the editor of a magazine called Ms. She's quite an influential figure in the US. If you want to look at more kind of popular culture versions of that period, there's also the show Mrs. America that came out a few months ago, which is based on the relationship between a right-wing activist called Phyllis Schlafly and feminists like Gloria Steinem. In the UK, you've got people like Sheila Rowbotham, who was kind of more of a socialist feminist. You've got people like Sylvia Federici, who talked about kind of the relationship between housework and kind of and women's rights, and the fact that women often did a lot of work out inside the home that they were never really kind of paid for, essentially. And then you've got a strong history of kind of black feminism, so people like Audre Lorde, who wrote about the kind of the experiences of black women in particular in the US, and people like Hazel V. Carberry in the UK as well, who wrote about the fact that often feminism in these contexts ignored the specific kind of issues that were affecting women of colour, and often focused on kind of white women's kind of rights to the detriment of other women.
And it's amazing, actually, isn't it, when you look at that period of second wave feminism, how much did change? Not to say, of course, they achieved everything they wanted to achieve, but actually there was so many changes and progressive movements during that period. It's quite staggering, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the US and the UK, we had the Equal Pay Act, which is not necessarily something that was, kind of just feminists that were kind of pushing for that. So obviously the Equal Pay Act, part of that comes from the Dagenham machinist strike in the late 60s, which was not necessarily linked to kind of an organised feminist movement. But at the same time in the US, you have kind of a lot of discussions about reproductive rights, women's access to kind of quite basic things like women's access to credit. So the ability to kind of get a credit card without having to ask for the approval of a partner. You also have things that would seem shocking now, which were just taken for granted. So obviously there's a much heavier focus on kind of consent and things like that in the present day, which wasn't necessarily there in that earlier period. So yeah, absolutely. And also just the fact that it became something that was very visible. So there was a lot of media that came out of that period that maybe wasn't there previously, which I think continues on to the present day.
Yeah, and I think you're right in terms of that it kind of combined with lots of other political changes at that time as well, wasn't it? Alongside the civil rights movement and everything else that was going on. Musically as well, it just seems such a big changing decade, the 60s in particular, perhaps more than any other decade.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got, this strong sense of kind of cultural change as well as political change, which sees this kind of rise of kind of pop music as we would know it today. Although, obviously often women were not necessarily as easily welcomed into that kind of cultural moment. So if we think of some of the big bands from that period, we tend to think of bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, but then we also have kind of the alternative kind of women's, feminist music coming through as well.
And you've already mentioned some of the different branches. So during that period, we saw kind of socialist or Marxist feminism, liberal, radical, black feminism. What kind of caused those different factions to branch off?
I think the main differences is what is seen as, first of all, what is seen as the priority, the main goals of of feminism, and what is seen as an effective way to reach the goals of equality. So for a liberal feminist, liberal feminism is very much concerned with kind of rights within the law. So, for example, the Equal Pay Act, the Equal Rights Amendment in the US, and kind of assumes that women will have more equality if they're kind of allowed within what have been predominantly male spaces. So we can think of, in the present day, like when we have more female politicians, for example, that is seen as a sign of progress. But for some feminists, or for socialist and radical feminists, the big issue with that is that you are not really changing the existing systems. You just kind of increasing the amount of women within those systems, which is still essentially oppressive systems. So Audre Lorde talks about this in her essay, "The Master's Tools Would Never Dismantle the Master's House." This idea that we can have more women, but if the system is oppressive, then that's only going to get us so far. So that is kind of one of the key differences. So for socialist feminists, they were very interested in class, and saw kind of women's oppression quite deeply linked to class oppression, and obviously using the work of Marx clearly in that. And then for radical feminists, they very much saw women as a specific class in and of themselves, and saw that actually women were oppressed most clearly because they were women. So there might be other oppressions at play, but it was their kind of identity as women which caused the oppression. And so for them, kind of dismantling that was the most important thing. So we can see like some of it's to do with aims, and some of it's also to do with the strategies that they used, quite different between the different groups.
Yeah, and I would suggest to listeners that for radical feminism, which is often very misunderstood, there is an episode with Dr. Finn Mackay, which you can go back and listen to. But it's fair to say that some people have a misconception about radical feminism being really extreme, don't they? Which some may have been, but actually a lot weren't.
Yeah, and I guess it also depends on what you mean by extreme.
Yeah.
So often the radical feminists are often perceived as negative because of the stereotypes that exist around them. And often those stereotypes exist because they didn't fit into kind of norms that we would understand about what a woman looks like, how she acts, how she behaves. So, yeah, and I think it's much more complicated than that. And again, it's quite porous. So a woman might be viewed as a liberal feminist to one person, but to another person, she seems like the most radical feminist there is. And so often it's we talk about these separate kind of categories, but it's much more kind of fluid than that in reality, how we are.
Yeah, I was going to say, a lot of people must cross the different viewpoints rather than just fit neatly into one of the boxes.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think about an issue, if you think about some of the issues that radical feminists were particularly concerned with, such as kind of like sex work or kind of pornography, there are probably a lot of liberal feminists that weren't particularly kind of didn't like that either. But I guess the differences would be the ways in which they felt that those issues could be resolved, whereas the liberal feminists might think about going through legislation, and radical feminists might think of a different way to kind of tackle the issue. So some of it is to do with kind of the strategies that you use rather than kind of opinions about a particular issue. And even within feminist movements themselves, there's so much disagreement that, I think we have to think about feminism as a plural rather than as a singular kind of movement, because there's so many disagreements there that, that we need to kind of consider that when we talk about feminism.
Thank you, Claire. That's going to be the end of part 1. In part 2, we're going to talk about waves 3 and possibly 4. Hi, welcome back to part 2 of the Sociology Show. I'm talking to Dr. Claire Sedgwick about an introduction to feminism. Claire, in part 1, we talked about waves 1 and 2 of feminism. Where do you set wave 3? When does it start, and what's distinctive about that particular wave?
So most people would set it as kind of starting in the early 90s period for a couple of reasons. Secondly, we have kind of proceeding before the third wave, we have what might be described as the backlash. So the backlash is seen as this idea that a lot of things that feminists wanted were happening, and then we have in the 80s neoconservative governments in both the UK and the US, and there is seen as this kind of rollback of women's rights a little bit, and this kind of increased focus on kind of traditional roles for women. And so in some ways the third wave is situated as kind of being in opposition to that, and so comes around this kind of 90s period. And it also coincides with some cultural things such as Riot Girl, which is a kind of music kind of scene which focused heavily on kind of feminism and women's empowerment. And also we see this in, towards the mid-90s, we see the rise or the beginnings of the feminist internet. So with feminist blogging, women being able to kind of talk to each other about kind of feminist issues. So yeah, I would say that kind of period of the early 90s is probably where we would situate it.
And it's interesting how it became really boomed, and maybe this is a bit of a mundane example, but you just mentioned mid-90s, and of course bands like the Spice Girls were advocating girl power, and it sort of really pushed it into a bigger market, didn't it?
Yeah, and I guess this is kind of a key kind of, this is another key issue within discussions about feminism, is that a lot of the bands that were in kind of Riot Girl, so bands like Bikini Kill, for example, and L7 and bands like that, they actually felt that the Spice Girls, although they were talking about girl power, it was quite a sanitized kind of version. It was quite palatable. You know, he wasn't really asking for any major changes. So I think there is, you know, we see on the one hand this, we get more feminism within popular culture more widely, but there is this question as to how radical that feminism is, or how kind of much that feminism is going to actually lead to kind of concrete changes. But yeah, I mean, compared to, you know, 30 or 40 years ago, that's absolutely a massive difference to kind of even have the concept of girl power.
Yeah. And if people haven't heard of a band like L7, look them up on YouTube. Couldn't be more different than the Spice Girls, to be honest.
No, absolutely not. And coming out of a kind of very much a punk ethos, but also a punk ethos that, you know, just as mainstream pop had done, has often kind of undermined women and women musicians. So this is very much a movement that, you know, that was very unapologetically feminist and unapologetically kind of female as well. Yeah.
And what were kind of the key issues of third wave feminism that made it distinctive from first and second?
I think a move towards thinking about culture, popular culture in particular, a move towards almost rejecting the idea that feminism had kind of had done its job. So alongside this period, we get this idea of post-feminism, which is not necessarily a specific movement, but is more kind of a sense of a feeling that feminism is kind of, you know, we needed it in the 70s when women had fewer rights, but, you know, we've got rights now, so we don't really need it anymore. So I think a lot of the third wave kind of discussions came out of the fact that actually that's not true. We don't have, you know, we don't have equality, and there are lots of ways in which we still need equality, but that's not necessarily going to just be it. We're not going to just be able to do that through kind of legislation, because so much of it is to do with culture, and cultures need to change. So attitudes towards women need to change, rather than just laws that exist need to change. So I think that's the key thing. And there are some really interesting texts that look at that. So Angela McRobbie's The Aftermath of Feminism is really good. Some of the stuff that Rosalind Gill has written as well, which really kind of put into context this period where feminism was seen as kind of somehow passé or kind of irrelevant. So third wave was really about saying, actually, no, that's not true. We need feminism just as much as we needed it in the past.
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning Angela McRobbie. That's another episode people can go back and listen to. But I was also thinking as well, you just mentioned, you know, we're starting to see the advent of the internet really kicking off mid to late 90s. And that's where we start to see a little bit more globalization in relation to feminism as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, because obviously, you know, one of the key things that the web provides is a way for people to talk to each other across geographical kind of barriers in a way that they haven't been able to previously. So yeah, absolutely. And I guess this is another thing to say, and I think this is worth pointing out. So Becky Thompson, she talks about this in one of her articles. She talks about this idea of a hegemonic kind of understanding of feminism. And actually, we need to think about the fact that often when we talk about these waves, we are talking about them in a UK and US context that don't necessarily map on quite the same in other places. But yeah, I mean, the internet kind of opens that up in a way that hasn't been able to before, even within places as well. So you might have had, you know, if you lived in a big city, you might have had access to a lot of feminist kind of groups and things like that. But if you lived somewhere quite rural, or if you lived in a small town, then obviously you wouldn't necessarily have that. So, you know, even within countries, we get this opening up that the internet can afford.
And the other thing that's noticeable is you start to see the word about intersectionality becoming prominent. Is that still part of third wave, or would that be more distinctive of a potential fourth wave?
No, I would say third wave. So, I mean, Kimberly Crenshaw's writing about intersectionality in a legal kind of framework in the early 90s. So I think there is at that point a much bigger focus on these kind of intersectional ways of thinking. I mean, again, obviously we have to be careful to recognise the fact that, you know, black feminists, working class feminists kind of were talking about these issues, you know, in the first wave, in the second wave, but we do see them coming to the fore much more in this period, and obviously this is something that we're increasingly talking about now as well. Yeah.
So let's talk about that fourth wave ? Fifth wave ? Why is there a debate as to whether we are in a fourth or fifth, or what is the distinction between those?
I don't know if there is a huge distinction, to be honest. I think the wave metaphor was much more useful at a time when we had these quite long periods of time, between things happening. I think if we think about the 90s, even though the 90s is now 30 years ago, because of the way culture changes now, it doesn't fit, it doesn't feel quite as remote. And so I think it's less helpful to maybe think about the wave metaphor in that respect, because it doesn't, I guess it almost feels a bit like we're moving into a fifth wave because a certain amount of time has passed, not necessarily because certain things have changed.
Yeah.
I do think if anything has changed over the past kind of 4 or 5 years, it's obviously politically, we're in a very different place than we were in 2012 and 2016. So that might be one way in which we can think about feminism changing. But that's more to do with kind of external factors than kind of the movement itself. I think one thing that has changed, which I think was already starting to, if you think about the Spice Girls example you used, is we get this rise of kind of celebrity feminism.
Yeah.
So feminists, celebrities identifying as feminists and having quite a lot of power to kind of enact change through their status as celebrities. And that's maybe something we didn't see kind of 10 or 15 years ago.
And one possible aspect of that, I'm interested to know what your thoughts on it, because one aspect of fourth wave feminism was kind of men referring to themselves as feminists. Even David Cameron did. Is that something distinctive of fourth wave feminism? Because we had the he for she movement as well, didn't we?
Yeah, I don't know if it's distinctive. I think that's always been the case to a certain extent. So, even at the very beginning of the feminist movement, in the second wave feminist movements, we had kind of men's groups that talked about feminism. There's always been kind of that idea of men, not being completely away from the feminist movement. I think for people like David Cameron identifying as feminism, as feminists, I think that speaks more to do with the fact that it's become something that is seen as something you would identify with across the political spectrum.
Yeah.
Which I don't necessarily think you would have seen kind of 10 or 15 years ago. I think feminism was often seen as something that was almost completely to do with being kind of on the left, and not something that, sort of Margaret Thatcher, for example, who was obviously often lauded as the first female prime minister that the UK has had, was completely anti-feminist. And she saw nothing for her within the feminist movement. So I think it's probably as much to do with that than to do with the fact that David Cameron is a man. It's just through the fact that it's become much more of a mainstream thing to identify as than it had been in the past.
Yeah. And can I ask you about that as well? Because there's quite a few debates online about whether men can refer to themselves as feminists or feminist allies or feminist supporters. And there seems to be a little bit of a split that some people are very much in favour that men should be, but some saying no, kind of keep out. This is a women's right group and men shouldn't be part of it.
I think as long as men recognise the fact that that men are not the focus of the issue, then and are aware of the privileges that they bring into those spaces, I don't necessarily have a problem with men kind of calling themselves feminists. But at the same time, I don't think that, I think that's probably the bare minimum.
Yeah.
I think sometimes the reason that people get a little bit cross at this kind of is it becomes almost, it comes a little bit kind of self-conscious. It becomes like, well, I'm a feminist. And that becomes a bit of a catch-all for kind of, oh, well, I'm okay because I'm a feminist. Whereas, for me, feminism is about what you do. Yeah. So it's less to do with whether you say you are, because, you need to kind of show it. And I think that applies to kind of women as well. So a lot of, Prissy Patel recently in a news magazine article called herself a feminist. But, for my version of feminism, that doesn't align with the things that I would say feminism is. So, I think some of that is to do with whether the title matches the values and the actions.
Because one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, this is often something that I get from my male students in particular, is that they say that feminism advocates gender equality, but actually there's very little in feminism which does advocate for perhaps where, men do suffer in some cases. What do you think about that? Is there a branch of feminism that does look at gender equality a little bit more equally?
I think it's tricky because I think that assumes that we're coming from a place where men and women are discriminated against because of their gender in equal measures. And I think most kind of measures of that suggest that's not true, and that, you know, still women are much more likely to be discriminated against because of their gender than men. So I think, you know, I think in that case it's only right that the focus is then on women's equality, which is not to say that is about kind of, you know, bad-mouthing men and saying, you know, men are terrible. It's about saying that we need to understand that the current system, you know, the patriarchy benefits men much more than it does women. And so until we can redress that balance, then that has to be the focus.
Yeah.
And that, yeah, I understand it because I think often it's quite difficult. And this is something that, you know, white women in the feminist movement themselves have also, you know, often struggled with. It can be quite difficult when someone's constantly telling you, you know, that you're the one that's kind of causing the problems. Yeah. But at the same time, you know, I think until we, you know, dismantle patriarchy, I think that has to be the focus. For the vast majority of history, men have been at the forefront of pretty much every political movement that's existed. You know, we still live in a male-dominated society, so I don't see why. I think we should be honest about the fact that the feminist movement is predominantly there for women. I mean, and obviously the caveat of that being that we might soon be thinking beyond gender full stop anyway, which is obviously probably a talk for a different day. But, you know, yeah.
It's kind of a parallel, isn't there, with the you know, the Black Lives Matter, and you had some people saying back, all lives matter, and people saying, well, of course they do, but the focus at the moment is on Black Lives Matter. It's kind of a parallel there,
absolutely.
Isn't there?
It's absolutely, it's really similar, and it's about the fact that, you know, I think if you are in a position where you're kind of, if someone tells you the reason that the feminist movement needs to exist, and your first reaction is, oh, but what about men? Then I think that maybe says something about the fact that you feel that your narrative and your kind of identity needs to be centred. And that in and of itself is a sign of privilege, because historically it has been men that have had the capacity to do that, to centre themselves in these narratives. So I think, but I mean, it's an ongoing process, isn't it? A lot of this requires self-reflection. And the one thing I would want to do is to say that, you know, if you think like that, if you've ever thought like that, you're a terrible person. But I think it is worth just thinking about, you know, why you think men should be more involved in the feminist movement. Where does that come from? And does that come from feeling uncomfortable at the fact that you're not kind of in the centre of the discussion?
Yeah. Because what you're just saying is really interesting in terms of realigning some parts of feminism at the moment as well, isn't there? Because there's this idea about that a lot of feminism is very much from white, educated, middle-class women, and we need to branch out more there as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, so a lot of the things that, as I said, a lot of the discussions that we have about kind of men within feminism, we can also have within feminism itself about the way in which historically white women, white kind of cisgender women have dominated the feminist movement. You know, partly because we live in a kind of a society that's been shaped by white supremacy. It's a middle class society, so a lot of it is you know, reflecting the society in which we live in. But yeah, and again, like I said, it is quite difficult at times to kind of step back and say, well, actually, is my voice the most important voice that needs to be heard? Or can we kind of, you know, can other people kind of speak instead? Yeah, it's, you know, I think that's the one thing that's, you know, that's common within those two things.
Yeah. And I'm going to plug another episode. Dr. Alison Phipps, go back and have a listen to that one. She wrote a wonderful book, Me, Not You. That's really well worth reading about the feminist movement. And I wanted to ask you, you mentioned possibly fifth wave feminism. What does that mean? Lots of people have heard 1, 2, 3, 4. What would fifth wave feminism look like?
I think it's tricky, isn't it? I don't know if I've got an answer. I think that's probably the era that we're living in.
Yeah. So
it's quite difficult to talk about, you know. So I think one of the changes is that we have got this focus on kind of, you know, feminism is much more mainstream. So we've got the idea of celebrity feminism. So feminists, you know, whether that's feminists who become famous, you know, themselves. So writers like Roxane Gay, for example, who's got, you know, kind of a kind of celebrity status, or whether that's celebrities that become known for their feminism. So people like Emma Watson, for example.
Yeah.
And then also alongside that, I think we're seeing a lot of people challenging the gender binary, so the idea. So throughout this whole thing, I've talked about men and women, but obviously, you know, that doesn't necessarily match up with the way some people identify. Some people identify as non-binary, who may have been assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth. So we get this idea that gender becomes much more of a fluid category, and I think that changes the way in which we see feminism, because it becomes less of this kind of men and women. It becomes more about kind of respecting this spectrum of identities. So I think that's currently what, you know, and Alison Phipps is really good actually for talking about this in her book. It's about kind of thinking about how we can challenge patriarchy in a way that doesn't discriminate against kind of gender diverse people, which I think is where we're at the minute.
Yeah. And you've mentioned throughout this podcast, you've mentioned loads of names. Is there anyone else that you'd really advise students to look up, to Google, who's maybe more contemporary, in fact, who would be good to look at from the contemporary side of feminism?
Yeah, so there's a few people in terms of. So I would also strongly recommend reading Alison's book, because it's amazing and really clear as well. Like it's definitely not, you know, full of academic jargon.
Yeah.
In terms of US feminists, there's Brittany Cooper wrote a book called Eloquent Rage. She's a Black feminist and talks quite a lot about the kind of her kind of experience of as a Black feminist, which I really enjoyed, and again is quite readable. So I would read it for fun. And what I'd also say, actually, and I know this is probably not the best kind of advice to give students, but actually social media has become a really, really useful place for finding out about feminism in a way that it maybe wasn't 10 or 15 years ago. So even looking at kind of some of the discussions that people have on Twitter, for example, or, you know, on Instagram, more likely on Twitter, you can see some of the range of kind of discourses around feminism, which I think is really helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of one of the distinctive features, isn't it? What's often referred to as digital feminism, quite indicative of the current wave.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess there is kind of, you know, there is a potential benefit of that, because it means that you don't necessarily have to be kind of, you know, studying within a university or a college setting. You know, it kind of, to a certain degree, democratizes feminism quite a bit. And it also means, as you talked about earlier, you can be talking to people across kind of countries, and kind of, you know, you're not so kind of centered on a particular location. So I think that is one of the big changes it's a much more kind of global because of the internet, which I think is quite an exciting thing, especially for kind of younger people.
Yeah, I think that's a really important feature. So if you have found feminism really interesting and you want to go and listen to some other episodes, as I said, you can go back and listen to Dr. Finn Mackay, Angela McRobbie, Dr. Alison Phipps, and you can also go back and listen to Claire's episode as well. So Claire, thank you very much for joining me and telling the listeners all about feminism.
Thank you.
If you are a regular listener to The Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes, and keep enjoying the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email thesociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.